What's happening in California, the actions that Trump is taking, federalizing the National Guard and imposing them, is actually something that Trump has been waiting for. It's part of an authoritarian playbook that almost every authoritarian in history has used. This is sort of stage one in a ramp that builds up to an ultimate seizure of power, taking almost all the levers of power into their own hands.
To have everyone on alert, I very much agree. This could really be a hinge point. I mean, this is really the moment where people have talked about the military, U.S. military, in the streets domestically of American cities being used at the president's discretion. And here we are, I think.
I'm going to explain exactly how that works and why this is something that Trump has been waiting for and trying to provoke for some time now, just after a quick word about the channel. I hope you're enjoying the video. As a psychiatrist who's fascinated by the worlds of politics and economics and philosophy, I love making these videos, and if you'd like to see more of them, then please do like and subscribe and comment in this video. What you'll find is that there's a beautiful community growing up around this channel. We're all going through a national and international trauma right now because of what's happening and where our leaders are taking us. And in this channel, you'll find people honestly sharing their situation and their distress, and other people responding with kindness, empathy, and compassion. So please join this wonderful community that we're forming, join in the comments and the dialogue that's happening. The power to federalize the National Guard has actually been something that all presidents have. It's an ability that all presidents can use, a button they can push if you like, to take the National Guard from any state into the hands of the president of the day. However, this is not a power that almost any president uses. In fact, the last time it was used was over 60 years ago. It's something that is used extremely rarely in cases of great emergency and great national turmoil. That is not what has happened here. It was a relatively peaceful protest outside a detention center where people were protesting about the fact that the way that immigrants were being treated, the way that ICE was conducting itself, was illegal, unconstitutional, and entirely immoral.
I'm Giovanna Lotta. You're taking a live look at one of the protests underway in Los Angeles just a few hours after the mass immigration raids. Chris Christie is live in Air 7 with the latest. Chris.
That's right, Giovanna. It's a major protest going on about 2 hours now. Close to 1,000 people now wrapping around the detention facility between Alameda and Los Angeles Street. They started on the front steps of the federal building at 300 Los Angeles, now marching down Aliso. And the lead there is that cattle truck leading the pack as they make the turn onto Alameda Street. The strategy here is to basically encircle the detention facility, which is that building right there, where we understand there are actually some people inside of the building.
ICE agents have been around all over Southern California, kidnapping people, tearing apart families, and we see this as an attack against our people. And so that's why you see young people, the community coming out and resisting this repression. We are tired, sick and tired of these attacks that are dividing and separating our families. And so that's why when we have these protests, they have been peaceful, but when the repression comes from the state, on Saturday, for example, in Paramount, California, it was a border patrol, it was brutal violence. They shot thousands of rounds of tear gas, of flashbang grenades, of all kinds of repressive instruments used against the community.
Officers repeatedly fired rubber bullets at protesters. One hit an Australian journalist as she was reporting from the streets.
After hours of standing off, this situation has now rapidly deteriorated.
Trump decided himself to push forward and federalize the National Guard, do something extreme that has not happened in half a century in response to this.
Look, Donald Trump has created the conditions you see on your TV tonight. He's exacerbated the conditions. He's, lit the proverbial match. He's putting fuel on this fire ever since he announced he was taking over the National Guard. An illegal act, an immoral act, an unconstitutional act, and we're going to test that theory with a lawsuit tomorrow. Under his executive order, it specifically notes, and under what the DOD did, is they had to coordinate with the governor. of the state. They never coordinate with the governor of the state. But there's a protocol, there's a process. He didn't care about that. And the worst part, he completely lied. He said in a tweet that everything's now safe, everything's fine. Is that the case, Mr. Trump? Unconstitutional, illegal act, his mess, we're trying to clean it up.
Now, why has he taken such an extreme action like this? Well, the fact is that this is actually a rap that authoritarians use. You see, they're looking for an excuse to start to impose themselves on the situation. They're looking for an excuse to try to engage in a violent conflict with other people. They will, of course, pretend that the violence was started by others, but it started by them. This has happened around the world, when an authoritarian tries to pretend that they're responding to violence when actually they're committing the violence themselves. And what's the point of that? Well, they want it to move up a gear. You see, what is quite possibly going to happen next is that, whether it's in this conflict or California or others, Trump will get to a stage where he deploys the military. In fact, that's already been mooted by people in his administration. Pete Hegseth has already said that they'd consider that. They've also already talked about things like suspending habeas corpus. Again, if you remember, this is exactly what Stephen Miller said.
Well, the Constitution is clear, and that, of course, is the supreme law of the land, that the privilege of the writ of habeas corpus can be suspended in a time of invasion. So I would say that's an option we're actively looking at.
So that means suspending all constitutional rights and laws for every citizen in order to do with them whatever they wish, at the end of the barrel of a gun, deploying the military and suspending people's constitutional rights and laws. Now, this, as I say, is exactly what authoritarians around the world do. It's a power grab. It's trying to create a conflict in order to then use it to expand their powers immediately. If you remember, I made a video just a few days ago now about the fact that Trump is waiting for some kind of an attack, some kind of an event that enables him to start to grab more power. Now, at the time I thought it might be a terrorist attack or something like that, but Trump isn't even waiting for that. He's going to use almost no excuse, a peaceful protest, to start to build up and expand his power. Now, what happens after that? You see, the thing is, the mindset of an authoritarian, whether consciously or unconsciously, is they want all or nothing. They either want it all, absolute and total power, or nothing at all. And so they're willing to gamble on that. And that gamble sometimes works, or sometimes it fails. You see, because what happens next is that once that violent response is then undertaken, the next step is that the public then react. They react with anger, and they react with even more protest. People come out into the streets. And at that point, the authoritarian is then forced to make a choice. Do they then react with a mass violence on a huge level or not? And if they do that, then they enter almost into civil war territory at that point. And then the people have to make a choice. What do they do next? Do they come out in even larger numbers and make it almost impossible, even with violence, to overcome them? Now let's look at some examples in history. One example in which this succeeded and one example in which this failed. An example in which this succeeded is actually from Ukraine. Now, Ukraine is a country that often leads the way and shows us what bravery really means. They show us how to stand up to tyrants. And they didn't just start doing that about 6 years ago when Russia first invaded Ukraine. It wasn't just a couple of years ago, it was actually many years before that. They didn't just show us how to resist tyranny then. They actually showed us how to do that all the way back in the 1990s. And why is that? Well, at the time, they had a leader who had undergone a democratic election. And he had clearly lost that election. Everybody knew. But what he did is he pretended he had won. He faked a few extra votes, or a whole range of extra votes actually, because he had lost in a big way. He faked a whole bunch of extra votes and then declared himself the winner. What then happened is that the public came out into the streets to protest. He then reacted with violence against those protesters. Now, my wife is Ukrainian, and she actually in those days, as a child, as a teenager, was out there in Ukraine. And what happened in response to that initial violent reaction from the administration is that millions and millions of people then poured onto the streets. And they basically said to Kuchma, who was the would-wanna-be dictator at the time, they basically said to him, you know what? You're going to have to kill us all, because we would rather die than live enslaved to you. And millions of Ukrainians poured onto the streets. In fact, the slogan, yes we can, came from there. Now, it was a very inspiring moment for the Ukrainian people. They never forgot what they managed to achieve. They poured out into the streets. They dared the dictator to destroy the entire country if he wanted to take it over. And of course he couldn't. He backed down. He lost all authority and had to give in. Elections were then held again. He lost completely and Yushchenko became president. It became a democratic country. And the Ukrainians never forgot what they sacrificed, what they were prepared to sacrifice for their freedom. As a result of that, when Putin then marches in, several decades later, they aren't going to give it up because they fought for it. And they are still fighting right now for their freedom. Now, they managed to become a democracy. They managed to elect one president after another as a result of that. Of course, it hasn't been a straightforward process. Of course, there's been bumps on the road, there's been ups and downs, but they managed to sort of push off the yoke of dictatorship in those early days. Now, here's an example of where it failed. In Russia, let's come down more to contemporary history now. When Putin invaded Ukraine, of course, it did shock people across the whole of Russia. Nobody thought he would do it. Even his own supporters, even his own cabinet didn't think they would do it. If you remember, he had a meeting in the Kremlin when he got sort of senior members of his administration to come and directly address him in front of the cameras about this. What he was trying to do is dip everybody's hands in blood, make it look like everyone was part of this process and this decision. The truth is, they were completely surprised by it. Everybody was surprised by it. Now, what happened is that protests started in the streets. People came out into the streets and started to protest against it. Putin then started to respond with violence, which he, of course, has done throughout the whole of his reign. He responded with violence, and people then started to get arrested. He then started to send people to gulags and told them that they were sentenced to decades in prison. So once he started to utilize violence against the people, what happened next is very different to what happened in Ukraine. See, what happened in Ukraine is they then poured in their millions into the streets, but that didn't happen in Russia. Russians actually stayed home, and in fear of the lives of themselves and their other fellow countrymen, they didn't engage in any protests. At that moment, Putin became more powerful than he ever had been. He had won. In the all or nothing stakes, he had got all. In the same way that Kuchma had got nothing, Putin had got all. So there always comes a crux moment, and authoritarian leaders are willing to roll the dice. They're like, you know what? I want it all or I want nothing. And they want to escalate to the point at which the people then have to make a choice. So what is likely to happen is that whether it's this skirmish in California or another one, Trump, he's not doing this by design, by the way, he's doing this by instinct. Trump will go up this ladder because he's a sort of instinctual authoritarian. He's not sitting there planning it out. There are others in his administration who are, like Stephen Miller and others behind him, J.D. Vance. They know exactly where this is headed and they're trying to game it out. Trump isn't doing that. Instinctively, what he'll do next is he'll start to deploy bigger and bigger force, including the military. The public will then come out in larger numbers. Then he'll be faced with a choice. Is he going to escalate the violence? And once he does that, then the rest of the American public will be faced with a choice too. Are we going to put ourselves in harm's way, and are we going to stand up to that en masse and make it impossible for him to do anything, just like the Ukrainians did? Well, that moment, I believe, unfortunately, is likely to come for America before too long. And this is the escalating series of steps that Trump is taking all of the country down to an eventual showdown. And as I've said often in this channel, to be forewarned is to be forearmed. This looks like that is where this is headed. And this initial confrontation in California is just step one to many steps that eventually lead people, the entire country, to have to make that choice. It seems that with Trump, any prediction we make has to be compressed in time. What we might believe could take years ends up taking weeks. And so I think we may be upon that stage sooner rather than later, before we know it, before we believe it could happen. Because what we are seeing is not a one-off, it's not an isolated episode, it's the beginning of an escalation that is sure to come to a head before too long. I hope you liked the video. I hope you also can join me with more of my content that I'm aiming to make over the coming months and years. You see, this time around, what we're experiencing in this administration is a global trauma, and the people going through it have been asking, how can we support ourselves? How can we learn and grow and share together through this process? So I've started to write a series of ebooks Thus, together with my whole team, once a month, we're going to produce an ebook to help us understand better the psychology of the people around us and the systems we're in, as well as our own psychology too, to help us navigate this increasingly confusing and disorientating world we find ourselves in. You'll be able to find those books on russellsbooks.com. That's russellsbooks.com. As soon as you go there, you'll be able to see the growing catalogue of books and hopefully buy any of them at any point. In addition, I hope you can subscribe to my e-newsletter. See, there's a link in the description of this video and also the description of the channel. And if you go there, you'll be able to fill out a form. Once you've completed the form, you'll then be able to get subscribed to my e-newsletter. And that way you can always be kept up to date about the content I'm producing. You see, the fact is that this platform, as well as all platforms, are owned by a very small number of oligarchs. And at any point, they might decide to shut down a channel like this. And if they do that, then, well, it's going to be hard for us to keep connecting. So if you sign up for my e-newsletter, that way you'll be able to make sure that you'll be informed about my content wherever it's delivered and wherever it lands. Finally, I hope you might also consider becoming a member of the channel. If you do, you'll get these ebooks for free every month. So all the ebooks I produce go free to my members who join the channel every month. Also, you can get priority response to comments, and there's also a members-only chat page for higher-level members that we engage in regularly to sort of learn, share, and support one another. As I say, this is a difficult time, it's a traumatic time in history, so many of us need support from each other. I'm hoping each of these things can help all of us create a better tomorrow together. Thank you.